Welcome to the Reason and Theology Show, everyone. I'm your host, Michael Lofton, here on a Monday evening, joined by esteemed guest, Dr. John Rowe. How are you, Dr. Rowe?
Well, miserable.
How come? What happened?
Well, no, I mean, because of the whole situation. I mean, personally, well, along with 99.75% of my fellow New Yorkers, but miserable because of this wretched situation,
Somebody was telling me that in New York, especially in New York City, that you really can't even go out of your house at this point. Is that true? That didn't sound right to me at all.
That is totally untrue. For one thing, the New York Police Department is the only institution that functions in the state of New York. And the New York Police Department is totally anti-government. And as a result, it does not enforce any of these absurd regulations. And even with that, the regulations in New York are not that bad.
Okay.
I mean, they're bad as far as I'm concerned, especially since recently they've canceled things like indoor dining. But what's happened in New York is that all of the restaurants have constructed these indoor dining areas. And as a result, these tiny passageways for the streets, because there are all these cabins that have been created where people are dining outside, and they are, as I speak right now, gathering to dine outside as well. Also, I mean, nobody enforces, I mean, at least the police don't enforce any kind of mask regulations. And then there's little shops that I go to buy my food in, and nobody here is in any way with the program, at least as far as those shops are concerned. It's more the with it liberal population that does any enforcing that's in any way of any kind of irritation.
What about places like Times Square? I mean, are there a lot of people gathered together in small places like that, or is it kind of clear in those areas?
I mean, again, there's lots of us here pay no attention to any regulations of any sort. So that, for example, I was at midnight mass at my traditionalist church, Holy Innocents, and there were 200 people there, and nobody was in any way bothered by any kind of restrictions. It's more the case that that you notice the problems or the restrictions. Well, I shouldn't say even restrictions, but the consequences of all of this in the office areas in Midtown and then in Lower Manhattan, in the Wall Street area, because the big businesses, the big corporations have decided that they like having their staff at home, and as a result of that, they have no interest in bringing them back again. So that, just to quote you one example, I have a friend of mine who works at a big skyscraper where normally there are 8,000 people working. There are 300 working there now. And they don't expect that to go up again because they are committed now to just keeping skeleton staffs in. And what that means, therefore, is that all of the businesses that worked off of the people who were in the offices can't function any longer. So we jokingly refer to Midtown now as Ghost Town.
They're pretty empty. Yeah, that's a different concept, at least for me, because I remember when I was in New York, I would go to some of these buildings and there would just be a tuxedo store in the building. And I was just thinking, this is an odd place to put a tuxedo store, but they have so many people coming into the building that it makes sense that you would have suits and stuff like that, tuxes.
Right. Well, that's, I mean, for example, in another building that I know of near Columbus Circle, a friend of mine was telling me that 2 whole floors were the commissary for the whole building, because a lot of the people just went to this commissary for lunch, but that's entirely closed down because there's no reason for it to exist any longer.
Right.
So all of that, and then all of that then plays out in things such as the people commuting into the city, the tolls that are collected, the taxes that are collected. And I mean, I don't care about that anymore because in any case,
Yeah.
I mean, our Marxist mayor, we have our Marxist mayor De Blasio, and then our just evil Machiavellian, cynical governor Cuomo, as I've mentioned, I think in an article in the Remnant, they remind me of two characters from the Julio-Claudian dynasty. Now Cuomo looks like Caligula, and De Blasio like Nero. And any kind of taxes they would collect would be just simply utilized for nefarious purposes. So I'm glad they're losing out.
Talking about taxes here and the, highways and all that. I think it was the New Jersey Turnpike. I think that isn't it the New Jersey Turnpike, where you're coming into New York from New Jersey, I think. Well, they had a toll there, and I was lost the first time I came to New York, and I didn't know what I was doing. So I ended up going through the toll about 4 different times, and I had to pay the toll each time. So ever since then, I hate that. So
Uh,
yeah, New York's an interesting
idea,
place.
yeah. Well,
Well, anyways, let me go ahead and get you to. Well, go ahead. I'm sorry. Well, I was just gonna say.
No, I just say it's sad.
Well, I think we might have a delay. I think you might be hearing me at a different time, or you might be delayed, and I'm hearing you at a different time. I don't know.
No. I can hear you fine. So
Excellent. Well, I was just going to say, a lot of our viewers, I'm sure, are familiar with you. You've written for the Remnant, and but for those who might be new to the channel, if you could just briefly introduce yourself, tell us, some of the things that you've written, who you've written for, your academic credentials, things like that.
Right. Well, I'm going to be turning 70 in January. I'm a New Yorker and from the area around New York as well. And I went to university ultimately for my doctorate to Oxford. And when I graduated, I came back to New York and then started working after a year for an organization which was called the Intercollegiate Studies Institute. I worked for them from 1978 to 1979. It's a conservative think tank which has had all kinds of different sorts of stages, I should say, to its history. But if you want to, we can address that later. And then since '79, I've been teaching for St. John's University in New York, European history. I'm an associate professor of history there. I very early on in 1969 became involved with the newly founded Roman Forum, founded by Dietrich von Hildebrand and his most important pupil, William Mara, and Father Vincent Michelli. And it was founded in order to defend Humanae Vitae, but quickly became an organization that was defending the traditional Mass and then the entirety of the Catholic magisterium. I worked for that for years, and then in 1991 took over as director. Since then, what we have done with the Roman Forum is we've used it for this extensive church history program that I have lectures posted on SoundCloud on the internet for. You can look at them for free. And we've been doing that for almost 30 years now. And we run this annual program in Italy also, not just on church history, but on all kinds of Catholic cultural issues, traditionalist issues, and the rest. The things that I've written extensively for a number of journals, including The Remnant, but the books that I've done, or the pamphlets that I've done, that's most important is my Americanism pamphlet, Americanism and the Collapse of the Church in the United States. And then in terms of books, my book called Removing the Blindfold, which is about 19th century Catholic revival and the assault on this erroneous and self-contradictory idea of freedom in the modern world. And then a book called The Black Legends, which is really something that takes up all of the lectures that we've done in New York and in Italy on church history in order to present a comprehensive introduction to the history of the church from the beginning down to the present.
You mentioned there the Roman Forum. Seems like I've seen some pretty big names speak there. Didn't you have Cardinal Burke at some point?
Well, Cardinal Burke is a good friend of ours. He hasn't actually been at our programs. I've been on panels and on conferences with him,
Yeah.
The problem with people like Burke for the programs that we run in Italy is that they coincide our programs with ordination times,
Ah,
and people like Burke are always
right.
uh, taken up
Sure.
with ordinations. But no, we've had lots and lots of people, and we're very much associated with and have been befriended by people like Cardinal Burke, also by people like the sorely oppressed Cardinal Pell, uh, who
Mm,
has been a good friend of ours,
mhm.
and whose fate. Well, I mean, now thankfully he's been vindicated, but the what he went through, we were warned about happening years, even a
Wow.
decade before it came onto the scene, because of the fact that we knew what his enemies had in store for him.
Mhm.
So yeah, no, we've traveled around in all sorts of interesting circles, and we continue to do so. And in fact, now with this unfortunate fraud that
Mhm.
we're dealing with globally at the
Mhm.
moment, all of these interviews are increasing,
Mhm.
so that who knows, I might have a an interview with the Chinese Communist Party soon if it goes on this way.
That would be very interesting if you did. You mentioned Cardinal Pell there. Yeah, I was so sad to see what they put him through, but very happy
Right.
to see that he was recently vindicated. We all knew he was innocent. We all knew it,
Oh, absolutely.
but it was nice when it came out and it was clear, and
Yeah.
then the ones that seemed to be operating against them themselves got exposed. So,
Right. Right.
the
Right.
truth came out, and light
Yeah.
was shed there on darkness. So it was good to see that, and it
Right.
seemed like he had a really really good attitude about it. It seemed like he wasn't really bitter from the interview that I saw afterwards. So it seems like
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah.
I mean, better him than me, because I really don't understand how you could be
He
like
was
that.
in maximum security prison, I
Yeah.
think. I mean,
Yeah.
they were doing him wrong. That was just really wrong. But
Well, I
yeah,
mean, it's like my own particular, if you want to call it that, my own particular pet heresy is my upset that martyrs get a better deal than confessors, because martyr, you go up, you get, I mean, mind you, some of you can be killed in rather brutal ways, but you have somebody like Pell in prison for a year, or people like St. Maximus the Confessor with
yeah,
their tongue chopped
right,
off and their hands
right.
chopped off. I mean that strikes me as pretty brutal. And
Yeah, yeah, in some way
I'd
it
rather have the
might
bullet
be a
in the
little
head.
harder than actual martyrdom, when we
Right.
talk about white martyrdom. Yeah. Uh, so yeah. Although it could get a little red because, like you
Yes.
said, their tongues were cut off and all kinds of other stuff. So,
Yeah.
well, anyways, let's talk a little bit about regalism and then Catholic monarchy. First of all, what is the difference between regalism and Catholic monarchy? Because I think a lot of people might not be familiar with the terminology. So, if you can maybe explain to us the terms involved here.
Well, let me just start from the basics. It's obvious from Catholic doctrine and from common sense that you must have this the Catholic seek to have the state in unity with the faith. I mean, it in some way or another has to be in unity with faith. It has to be doing things that are in accord with the faith, and then it has to, under the best of circumstances, give a proper worship to the true God. But that's something which is true of every state, regardless of what it might be, whether it would be a republic or whether it would be a monarchy, whatever, or a dictatorship by a military, whatever it might be. So that's one thing. So a Catholic monarchy, a true Catholic monarchy, like a Catholic republic, would have to be something that worked in union with Catholic faith and with common sense and with reason and with the way in which all of those work together, given particular circumstances at given times in history. Regalism is a term which, in Catholic, in the context of the Catholic world, would refers to the appropriation of the prerogatives that the Roman state claimed, even in pagan times, in terms of being responsible for the Pax Deorum, the peace of the gods, and what role the leader, the emperor, in the case of the Roman imperial state, had in protecting this, and appropriated to Catholic circumstances. What that meant is that, especially from the time of Constantine onwards, with his chief apologist Eusebius of Caesarea, an Arian, by the way, from that time onwards, and then utilized by various Catholic monarchies, the idea was that somehow or other the state, the monarchical state that called itself the Christian state, could nevertheless still exercise the same kind of prerogatives as the old Roman state, regally. I mean, the term regalism just refers to the regalian rights or the royal rights or the imperial rights. It could utilize these, but in a way that gave to the monarch a kind of special, really ultimately clerical role, in ways that, in terms of the real Catholic tradition, and certainly the Roman tradition, the Western Catholic tradition, have been contested as being exaggerated, as being terribly exaggerated. So it's an exaggerated regalism. It's an exaggerated claim to a sacred role that in some way or another endangers the hierarchy of values in terms of who's ultimately in charge in determining what's Catholic and what isn't.
Now, you were talking there about the state, if I understood correctly, the state upholding the faith of the church,
Right.
maintaining what it teaches. Does that then mean that in Catholic theology and also political theory, that there wouldn't be a notion of a secular or a neutral state?
Well, I mean, there would be an understanding of under unfortunate circumstances, there being a reality where the state would not be doing the full job that it's supposed to be doing. I mean, this in 19th century Catholic thought, because it's then that these terms began to be used. There's the distinction between what's called the thesis and the hypothesis.
Mhm.
The thesis is what ought to be. The hypothesis is what exists at a given circumstance, under given circumstances. And the argument to begin with, and I think this is supremely important, is that unless what you do is you identify what the ideal is, what the reality of the ideal is, that you can't really talk about the particular circumstances properly, because what you do is you let everything flounder, and then you let the particular circumstances determine what the norm should be. So the enemies of this argument say, oh, there's always this discussion of some sort of utopian theoretical goal, and then the reality, which is what they claim is always the situation, is made subject to it in an ideological fashion, and that's not really true at all. And the people in the 19th century among Catholics who made this distinction, they made it very, very clear. And I did a lot of work on this for my doctoral dissertation, which was on the syllabus of errors of Pius IX and the development of it. But they made it clear that that a lot of the problem in understanding what's at stake over here is due to the fact that, historically speaking, the whole development of reason, the whole development of philosophy, the whole development of the Socratic hunt for the true, the good, and the beautiful was something which was very, very, very tricky in terms of for being fragile, because it was a kind of parlor sport until Christianity came along and gave it clout. And it's only when Christianity came along and gave the value of human reason as something which was central to the whole the whole of creation that God had not only made to be good, but then had redeemed. It was only with that, and then with the incarnation, that things that involved reason and philosophy and common sense were given a real power behind them. And so, unless what you did is you took the faith seriously, and what the teachings of theology were seriously, and the world of grace seriously, you couldn't count on reason and philosophy and common sense being taken seriously. So that if what you did was you tried to discuss what the reality of things were on a rational level, on a philosophical level, and then on a practical historical level, without taking the real clout given to these things by theology and by grace seriously, that what you were going to do is you were going to let everything just flounder in the hands of whoever it is that was the most powerful, in a way that allowed the triumph of the most willful to dominate. It's only with a discussion of what is theologically true and what is possible as a result of grace that you can know what it is that reason and common sense and philosophy teach you about this stuff as well. Now, the reason why I'm bringing that up is because a lot of the people who attacked the faith especially the moderate Enlightenment way in the 18th century and the 19th century, they claimed that you didn't need theology, you didn't need faith, you didn't need any of these things to understand what the state ought to do and ought not to do in a way that would be protective of human freedom, proper human rights, all of the rights of the different elements of society, because it was all commonsensical and rational and clear. And it's all been demonstrable that since the destruction of the faith, that everything that is supposedly purely rational and commonsensical goes by the board as well. So that nowadays we have people that are just, all of the demons from hell that are affecting us right now, including people who are supposedly representatives of an older legal order of things like Dershowitz, like Dershowitz, who debates people like my friend Chris Ferrara. They claim there is no such thing as natural law. There is no such thing as natural law. And so what you get without the firm Catholic position is basically a position in which, fascist, Nazi, triumph of the will rule determines what it is that's rational or not. So, this has been a long roundabout way of answering your question to indicate that without the faith and without grace, everything that we talk about as being rational, everything that we talk about as being commonsensical, everything we talk about as being prudential in terms of trying to determine whether you have a situation in which there's a divided society and it might not be the case that you can enforce all of the kinds of moral positions that a Catholic order at its best would consider to be possible. All of this stuff goes by the board. And all it ends up meaning is that without what we have to offer in the way of an ideal, you just get whoever is strongest pounding his fist down and telling you that that's right. And that's what we see around us. And that's what we're going to see more and more if this illegal president gets inaugurated in January 20th.
Nietzsche, he who has the biggest stick, basically.
Yeah. So in other words, back to the basic line there, there's no prudential application of a rational understanding of how you modulate your implementation of a Catholic moral order without the framework of the Catholic moral order. Otherwise, you're just simply in the hands of whatever the tyrants wish, or whatever is left over as a kind of up until recently there was Santa Claus left for Christmas, and that's gone now too. So.
It seems like you're saying, please correct me if I'm misunderstanding some points. It seems like you're saying that, of course, the Catholic faith should inform reason. But would it be the case that even those things that we can know by reason alone, it would seem that some of those things that we can know by reason alone are in conflict with what the governments today often propose. It would seem that we could know certain things by the natural law. We could know that it is wrong to commit certain acts that the government says is okay.
Right.
Perfect example, same-sex marriage. We can throw that out as an example. I would say by reason alone, according to the natural law, we could know that that is not something a state should propose. Would you agree with that, or did I misunderstand?
No, that's exactly what I was getting at. That's exactly what I was getting at. I'll give you an example from the 19th century.
Mhm.
When the Third French Republic, very anti-clerical, very anti-Catholic, uh, secularized or attempted at least completely to secularize education, one of their arguments was that what we consider to be the moral law with regard to things like marriage and aside from these other matters that they wouldn't even dream would have been possible, that all of this would be better defended by them on the grounds of reason alone, because of the fact that the Bible is so idiotic and irrational, and church history is filled with all sorts of, as far as they were concerned, immoral Catholics. They claimed that they would better enforce what it is that we claimed we were in favor of. And when you brought up this kind of an argument, because as I mentioned before, I did my work for my doctorate on 19th century preparation for the syllabus of errors. When the Catholic thinkers who predicted all of this would happen came up with all their arguments, they were told that they were idiotic because of the fact that no one in their right mind would ever, because of common sense, accept such viewpoints. I mean,
And they're
you
eating
know, I
those
mean,
words today.
I mean, yeah, I mean, it reminds me. I can't remember. I don't have the exact citation at hand, but someone apparently, from my memory, someone attacked Jeremy Bentham and his utilitarian principles in the 19th century. When he said you have to do everything for the greater good of the greater number. And somebody said, well, what if the greater number of Englishmen say that for the greater good, a large chunk of the population has to be eliminated? And he said, no one would ever think that way. Well, give them time.
Abortion.
Or rather, I should say, we have given them time, and they do think that way.
Abortion. Yeah.
So,
Yeah, with the issue of abortion, I think that's where we're at. I think that, Aquinas talks about this as well. There's a lot of things that we can know by reason alone, but faith really helps us arrive at those conclusions quicker and easier because not everybody does very careful thinking and has
right,
enough time to do the proper
right.
thinking that we can know certain things by reason alone. Not everybody has that. So faith helps supplement that and helps strengthen what we could know by reason. And I think that, yeah, this is where the Catholic Church really could step in and show that certain conclusions that we can make by reason ought to be concluded, ought to be taught. And we also know that from the deposit of faith. So, yeah.
Yeah, and
Now,
in addition to the other thing,
go ahead.
the other thing in addition to this is that it's grace alone that gives you the strength to believe in your reason. It's only it's only because you've got the strength from grace that you can actually believe that what it is that your reason is telling you is true.
That's fair. That's fair.
You
That's
need
fair.
it. You need
Right.
the supernatural grace to strengthen what your weak
Sure.
reason tells you ought to do.
That's true, because I think some people might conclude certain things that are erroneous and think that it's based on reason, but it's actually,
Right.
a distortion. Now, can you also clarify another point for me? It sounded like you were saying that regalism is basically connected to imperialism. It's connected to the imperial state. Is that correct? Did I misunderstand that?
Well, no, every state since Roman times has, every state that has a memory of history bases its claims to its authority upon what the Roman imperial state claimed. And what the Roman imperial state claimed is not really different from what the Roman Republic claimed. I mean, it's a question of supreme authority. The problem is, once again, that that Christianity introduces a new element into the picture. I mean, this is the irony that is another one of the many ironies that are lost to people in our own time, that the only way in which you have a separation of church and state is with Christianity, because Christianity creates a separate church from a state. And it's only with Christianity that you've got the idea of two authorities that have a claim to sovereignty that need to negotiate with one another. And as a result of that, you cannot claim the same powers as an ancient Greco-Roman state, and a Roman imperial state, in a Christian environment without modifications, and very, very serious modifications.
Right. Yeah. Modifications indeed.
Yeah.
Because it does seem that we modified quite a few things, but we did take a lot of things from the Roman Empire. So what you're saying is there are some elements that we could take, but there were some elements that were incompatible, and those need to be modified. Correct?
Oh yes, and quite frankly, I mean, among the people who were enamored of what we found, what we took from the Greco-Roman world, and the Roman world legally and in terms of state matters, among the early ecclesiastical writers and church fathers, you have people who bring up the brilliance of, let's say, Roman legal thought, and the way in which it entangles itself in contradictions in dealing with Christianity. And now let me see if I can remember this correctly, because it's, again, a contradictory legal principle. I want to state it, but I think it's Tertullian, who is a lawyer himself, who brought this up, that there is this bizarre situation that develops in Roman legal practice in dealing with the Christians, whereby, and I think it's with the exchange between the Emperor Trajan and Pliny, the governor in one of the provinces in Asia Minor, where what happens is they say that the Roman state says that you've got to not bother the Christians, unless they're brought up and accused of something. And then, and this is where, and I believe it's Tertullian who brings this up, then what you're told is that you've got to drag the Christians before you and use all of the force of the law to get them to confess that they are not guilty. Now, this is not the way standard police practice operates. You drag up criminals to confess that they're guilty, but you've got them coming up there because you know that they're really not people that you want to find guilty of anything, because they're otherwise, as far as Pliny says, perfectly law-abiding citizens, except that they're not adhering to the ultimate acceptance of the state as the final authority. So what you do is you drag them up in order to try to, through all kinds of means, convince them to confess that they're innocent of the crime that they're committing. Now, he says, Tertullian, who does this as a policeman? You drag the criminal in front, you beat the hell out of him to say, tell me you're not guilty. It's just not true. It's because they know there's a problem with what they're doing, because it's not real what they're after. These people, as Pliny told Trajan, are not guilty of anything other than not accepting the ultimate worldview that we're promoting. And there's a number of Christian apologists who are able to play on this a good deal and say, we are the strongest defenders of the existing order. The problem is that you don't understand what it is that really defends the existing order, and you're therefore promoting what brings it down, because you will not play fair with those people who best know what's true, what's good, what's beautiful, what creates an order of things. And there's a certain sense of guilt there that a man like Trajan dealing with his governor feels. And that's the oddity of the whole thing. There's so much that's good in the Greco-Roman tradition, but the problem is breaking through. It's like you have a glass in front of you, and you've got to break through that glass and let people see through what it is that's blocking fully their vision of what the reality is that they don't want to see. They don't want to see. I have another, if you have time later,
Yeah.
I wanted to quote to you something I just read yesterday, which really stunned me, which I think is valuable in this regard and with regard to many other things too. But you might have other
No,
topics.
well, let's hear it, and I'll ask my question on the end.
No, what it is, quite frankly, is if you don't mind my bringing up the current situation,
Sure. Yeah.
yeah. I mean, when this whole the disease thing sprang on us, probably like everybody else, for a moment I thought, oh my gosh, what is this? The bubonic plague? Is this God's punishment for us? And then what I did was I started to look at, first off, the statistics that were coming in from Italy, which is the first place that really shut things down as they did. And I looked, and when I was looking at the statistics, I got the same statistics that you get everywhere, that you're talking about 0.025%, whatever, of the population, and then limited, groups that were really affected by it. And then I said to myself, let me run through the whole World Health Organization, Fauci, and then ultimately, all of the forces in league with Fauci, sacred narrative about this whole thing. Let me run this through my brain, and let me make believe that it's my doctoral dissertation at Oxford, right? Mm-hmm. And let me make believe that I actually believe what these people are telling me, exactly everything that they believe, right? And let me also then say that I go before my doctoral examiners at Oxford and I say, this is the truth. This is the truth. And when I did that, I realized that my doctoral examiners would have failed me, because they would have said, but you haven't investigated. Who are these people? What's their background? Do they have any kind of self-interested motives that they're promoting? Are there other forces involved here? What is it? Who is it that's winning out with this? Who is it that's losing with this? And then when I did that, and I'm talking about last March already, all you had to do even then was go on something which is dubious, but nevertheless was there in the public arena as a kind of major source like Wikipedia, and you could see people like Fauci were connected with all kinds of dubious and very, very troubling self-interested groups, including Bill Gates and the whole crew and the Wuhan crew and all the rest. So it was very, very, very much the case that you had a fraud or a potential fraud that you were dealing with, that you had to continue to follow up and expose. Now, the reason why I said this came to my mind just because of something I read yesterday was I have to confess, I mean, I knew a lot about Davos and the World Economic Forum and the Great Reset and all this other stuff. I knew a lot about that from a conference in Mexico that I took part in 2 years ago on transhumanism and posthumanism with an international Catholic legal association. I knew nothing about these subjects, but they wanted someone with a historical perspective, and I had to investigate it. And it was at that moment that I really saw what all of this Great Reset, World Economic Forum stuff was all about, and who was involved with it, including not just the UN, but the Vatican and all of the big corporations, Wall Street, the World Pharmaceutical Organization, technology, everything. And then what happened is, on Christmas Day, my wife gave me this book about the CIA and the Kennedy assassination. Now I have to say, up until Christmas Day, I had never thought about the Kennedy assassination. or the CIA or anything like that. I'd never thought anything about this whatsoever. I just took the standard line seriously. And then I started reading the book, and I haven't been able to put it down. And there's a long citation in there from Charles de Gaulle. From Charles de Gaulle, after the Warren Report came out. And this citation from Charles de Gaulle is astonishing because it says that what we have here, he's talking about the Warren Report, he says, is an obvious cover-up designed to present what people want to present in order to prevent a further investigation from taking place. It's clearly designed to avoid bigger difficulties that the American government does not want to deal with, but it's an enormous fraud, and the piper will have to be paid in the future. You know, now this is Charles de Gaulle, and it's from a citation that is provable, and there's no doubt about. What the reason why I'm bringing this up is that there's so much that's there right in front of us with regard to what it is that's true about the Catholic faith, its relationship with government, its relationship with trying to maintain some kind of order of things, the impossibility of maintaining order without the teaching of the Catholic Church, the endless numbers of frauds that are perpetrated because of refusal to take the Catholic Church seriously. And the reason why people take them seriously is they don't want to confront the evidence. And that's what Paul said in this statement. They don't want to confront the evidence. And this was followed up in the book by a statement by Arthur Schlesinger, one of the chief aides of Kennedy, of John F. Kennedy, who, when presented with a lot of information, said he didn't want to look at it. He just simply didn't want to look at it because of the fact that it was disturbing. And it reminded me of there's a great book by for heaven's sakes, why can't I remember his name now? One of my professors at Oxford, a book, Peter, it'll come to my mind, but on late antiquity, where what happens is that the arguments that I just presented to you from the Christians about the beauty of Roman law and its self-contradictions was brought by Christians in front of judges persecuting them in the 200s in ancient Rome. And he quotes a Roman judge who says, "I will not even look at any evidence that that disturbs my understanding of what the Roman state thinks I ought to think about these matters. I just will not look at it." And that's the problem with all of this stuff. They will not look at what the reality is.
A lot more could be said there. We might need to do a whole show on that, on the Great Reset. I think that would be fun. You mentioned the role of the Catholic Church in relation to this state, and one of the questions that I have is, when we're talking about thesis, what ought to be,
Right.
is it the case that the government should be a Catholic monarchy, or is it permitted to have a democracy or some other form of government?
Well, the understanding that the church has on these matters is that whatever the actual form of a government is, it would exercise its power in the same sort of way. It can only do what it is that's in line with what's true and what's morally good. And whatever the shape of the government, it would operate in the same fashion. The way in which these matters have been discussed, I mean, remember that the church, not just the church, but the Western world as a whole, in which Christianity took root, had as the cradle in which it grew up the Roman imperial state. And so, just like anything human, or anyone human, what you do is you take for granted operating in the context of what it is that's familiar to you. So they operated in the context of the international imperial state. And that's already important for illustrating our point, because this is something which is disturbing to a lot of Catholics that they took it for granted that the state was an international organization. It was not the nation state. It was the imperium. It was the international state. But a national state or an international state would both have to operate according to the same kinds of basic rules. The actual distinction in terms of what it is that's monarchical, what it is that's democratic, what it is that might be representative are issues which are not really importantly addressed in a theoretical way until the 19th century. I mean, in one sense, they were practically very, very much addressed from the time of the High Middle Ages onwards, even the Middle Ages onwards, because Italy was filled with republics. It was filled with republican city-states in the 1100s, the 1200s, 1300s, 1400s, and the situation there really did not involve issues which were any different than a monarchy or an empire. Because if you take the Venetian Republic, for example, the Venetian Republic is a republic, an oligarchic republic, not a democratic one, but an oligarchic republic in the hands of a merchant aristocracy. But there, that republic claimed the same kind of regalian, regalist rights as monarchies did that were problematic as far as the church was concerned. And in fact, the church had huge battles with the Venetian Republic over these matters in a more theoretical, an advanced theoretical way than it did with monarchies, ultimately ending in the great battle that it had in the period of the so-called Venetian interdict in the early 17th century. So the issues are the same with regard to all of them: monarchy, republic, of limited voting, and then democracy. In the 19th century and then the 20th century, you get Catholic thinkers who talk about the various elements involved here more seriously. And especially when they talk about the way in which historically Catholic monarchies operating in a fashion that was considered to be good by theoretical political teachers were concerned, that what they did is they operated by principles of what is popularized in the 19th and 20th century under the term of subsidiarity. You know, that monarchies, Catholic monarchies, had no passion for trying to control everything from the top to the bottom, and that they intervened and guided things when it reached a level that required harmonization. And in this respect, even with monarchies that the church clashed with at times, like that of Philip II in Spain, Philip II was very, very much concerned for not stepping on any kind of subsidiary rights, because he ruled over an empire that had many different component parts, that had different laws and different customs that he didn't want to disturb. And when 19th and 20th century Catholic thinkers looked over these principles, they said democracy, democratic involvement in political affairs is something that was instinctively treated seriously by Catholic-minded political leaders in monarchical systems as well as other systems, because of the fact that they recognized that they should not interfere in what the local community considered to be really important, because the realm in which the people in general concerned for what they want should most be heard is in what affects the cat's tail has just entered into our picture here. I'm sorry about that.
Oh, no, it's fine. There it is. That's great.
It most enters into the picture in what it is on a day-to-day basis that is really most enters into what bothers people. Who's living in your neighborhood, what they're doing, whether the shops can be open, whether they're shut on holidays, what prices they might be charging under certain circumstances. All of that is something in which the democratic feeling of the local populace should be heard. And in our current democracies, that's the realm in which they're least heard, because it's certainly the realm in which, my neighborhood, the mayor or the governor could least care, has any kind of impact over anybody. So yeah, it's not the popular will. It's the popular will on the level where the populace is most concerned about matters of this sort. And generally speaking, yes, with the Reformation, especially because of the religious questions and religious divisions, and then also with the monarchies rebuilding themselves at the same time, concerned about internal quarrels over which dynasty was in charge. There's an unacceptable effort to try to dominate all kinds of local matters in a way that would be considered by Catholic thinkers to be offensive. But even there, I remember decades ago, a professor of mine as an undergraduate, a non-Catholic professor of mine, pointing out to me that Louis XIV in France would never have dreamed of telling his population that all of their children from the age of 5 to 16 had to be taken from their family homes and shoved into rooms to be indoctrinated by him.
Oh. Wow. There's some really good questions I'm seeing here in the chat, and I want to get to some of those if that's okay. This one caught my eye just as we were speaking there from Rusty. Asked Dr. Rowe which type of monarchy would be the most ideal. What do you think there?
Well, I think you can't go far astray from what people like Aristotle and Plato talk about. A mixed monarchy. Let's go back to something which is once again very important to us right now. This idea of deep state. The idea of deep state, because if you have a government which is not strong enough in the realms that ought to be strong, in terms of, let's say, having a strong executive authority that's really in control of what's going on for enforcing the laws and what the police power is doing, then what happens is that you allow for all of these extra legal, extra state authorities to use money, to use nowadays the media, to use all kinds of forces to control things in a way which is infinitely more dangerous than an open political authority might do. And that's what is really at play here with the deep state. The deep state is not a state that's exercising its legitimate powers strongly. It's a state which is taking advantage of the weakness of a government to allow occult powers, and by occult I mean just hidden, whether it be money or media or whatever, to actually dominate things. So it's not that, it's not the case that, let's say, for example, you have a king that is strongly enforcing the authority of the king over the army, or over what's necessary for protecting the state economically from abuses from other states. That would be a problem. That's not the difficulty. The difficulty would be a state in which the king, sorry, with the cat, where the king would try to interfere too much with your local control, your local neighborhood, your educational authorities, the church authorities, in ways that all of these evil forces that we're dealing with now are indeed interfering, whereas a person like President Trump can't interfere with them. In fact, He can't even control the media. He can't even allow whatever it is that he wants to say to be said. If you had a king who could not allow his own voice to be heard, that would be really bad. That'd be really bad. And that's what we've got now. So
Yeah,
you
he
need
gets silenced on Twitter.
a strong enough state in the realms that ought to be strong.
Mm.
You need a strong enough church in the realms that ought to be strong. And you need to have these forces know that they have to butt out in the areas where they ought not to be involved in. And traditionally speaking, without the interference of outside heresies or ideologies of one sort or another, they tended, monarchies and then the papacy, to give you another example, to not be involved. In fact, the biggest problem historically with the papacy for the church has been that, to use the Roman term, Peter is asleep most of the time, and you have to find a way to rouse the authority to do something. And it's similar with a lot of the monarchical state authorities. You have to rouse them generally to do something, because they generally don't do it. But you can't want them weak in the areas where they ought to be strong. That's the thing, because then they allow for the other forces to dominate everything and claim that they're doing it in their own name as well, which is really bad.
It sounds like you're also saying that, if I'm misunderstanding, correct me, the freedom of speech should be regulated. The talking here about the deep state, there shouldn't be something in the state that just can say whatever it wants, control, can put whatever it wants out there in the media. That it should be regulated. Did I understand that correctly?
Yeah, I mean, it's a tricky phenomenon, because once again, it's like a kind of accordion and a yin yang situation here with regard to this stuff. But perhaps it would be best for me to flip it around the other way. That I can't remember who it was, but decades ago, one of the Supreme Court justices said that he couldn't define pornography, but he knew it when he saw it.
Right. Right.
Well, right now, we all know an illegitimate control of speech, because we see it.
Right.
We see it all around us. We know what is illegitimately being controlled, because you see this hypocritical stripping of the right to be able to say things, with an argument utilized by people who abandoned that argument because they said it was wrong, that this is offensive to community standards, and or the error has no rights. I mean, these are people who never argued that this was possible, and now they're utilizing these arguments to destroy all freedom of speech. So we know what an illegitimate blocking of freedom of speech is all about. Traditionally, what is the case is that states and the church have operated on the basis of, more than anything else, trying to just simply to maintain what is understood by long-term history and belief to be something that has to be controlled. And if you're making a mistake, it's an accordion-like approach towards dealing with perhaps increasing the restrictions or weakening the restrictions. I mean, my good friend Dr. David White, who is not just an expert on literature but on music, pointed out that that in the history of the church, with polyphonic music, with the introduction of music in many voices, not just one voice, that you had to be very careful about this stuff, because the many voiced music that you had available to you was music that in some cases was involved with unpleasant lyrics, unacceptable lyrics, heretical lyrics, pornographic lyrics, and so on and so forth. And you did not want to in any way give the impression that you accepted any of this. So that what you had to do is you had to be very careful about allowing the introduction of something that might have a certain room for it, but only when it was so introduced to the scheme of things that was understood to be the true and the good and the beautiful, that it could be allowed. So it's a realm where you need restrictions, where there sometimes can be a lessening or an increasing of restrictions. It's not fixed ultimately in stone, but it's not fixed ultimately in stone because there's not true good and beautiful, but because you might have a perception which is a little bit askew of what is helping or hurting it. But when you operate the other way around and you are exposed to what it is that's a violation of freedom of speech for bad purposes, I mean, it can smack you right face on, and we're smacked right face on with it at the moment. So we know exactly what it is that involves a horrible control of freedom of speech right now. The other way around is something which has to be plugged into the entire history of the wisdom of the church and of the state operating in union with the church to be able to determine. And it's not something that you can write in any kind of absolutely clear-cut way, in the same fashion that you can't write in an absolutely clear-cut way how it is that you discipline your children. Sometimes your children have to be disciplined with a firm hand. Sometimes they have to be allowed a little leeway. Sometimes they have to be listened to as well as taught to. I don't know if that makes sense to you.
It does, and I want to get to this one, a super chat from Event Horizon. Thank you for the super chat there. Could you get Dr. Raos' thoughts on religious toleration under a Catholic monarch, as and evangelical names like Tyndale, Sattler, and Huss come to mind?
Yeah, no, I mean, here too, I mean, that's an interesting choice of names that you picked up over there, because people like, you pick somebody like Tyndale. I mean, this is a problem with heretics all through history. And I'm trying to remember the names of the books, but there's one book that I know of, which is called The People's Reformation. And then there's another book by, I can't remember the author of that book, but then there's another book by a man named Cameron called, I think, The European Reformations. And they point out that that these people, like a Tyndale and others that you mentioned here is one name involved, that you've got ideologues that you're dealing with. You've got ideologues. And when you're talking about religious toleration, you're not talking about toleration. You're talking about allowing you're talking about allowing an entry into the public forum of people who have got an ideology that they're promoting and who have absolutely no room for permitting any other views to be tolerated. In other words, probably the thing that's most characteristic of Catholic authorities and the mainstream Catholic population through the whole history of the Catholic Church, and this is true really of just everybody who in some way or another is defending some kind of tradition. The thing that's probably most true is how complacent they are, and how unaware they are of what it is that's building up as a powerful force against them, trying to destroy them. And as a result, they tend to be more indifferent and then more flexible towards enemies than they ought to be. And then what happens is that under the rubric of allowing toleration, what you allow into the picture, the people who are the very ones who have absolutely no room for any kind of toleration, And then these people ride roughshod over you and destroy not only the freedom to promote the truth, but the freedom to promote even different forms of errors of the varied heretical forces that are espousing their wares. so that it's very tyrannical in character, and it's always been like this. And this has been the main characteristic of what people with a capital R call the revolution in general. What we call the revolution since the Enlightenment and the naturalist political approach, secularist political approach of the 17th, 18th century, is an approach which has promoted freedom in a way that has just simply imposed a tyrannical view on everybody else. One of my examiners, my doctoral examiners when I was at Oxford, Owen Chadwick from Cambridge University, said in a book of his called Secularism in the 19th century, he said, whenever you hear the word freedom, what it means is what it is that 1/3 of the rich people in the 19th century think is important, and that's it. So that everybody else is squelched. And these books on the Reformation I quoted, The People's Reformation, I wish I could remember the name of the author of that one. Abrams, I think his name is, but then Cameron in the book on the European Reformations, they point out that when the population understood in 16th century Europe what it is that the religious reformers, tortured by the persecution of the Catholic Church, wanted, they didn't want any part of it. But when they found out that they didn't want any part of it, it was too late, because the tolerant people had prevented them from having any kind of choice in the matter. And in fact, John Locke, later on in his essay, on his defense of religious toleration, he points out that the only people who are entitled to religious toleration are those people who tolerate anything religiously, and therefore the Catholics can't have any kind of religious toleration. It has to be those who tolerate anything religiously, because of the fact that if you allow everything to be tolerated religiously, you have such a division religiously that all the religions are checked and balanced, and secularized minds can dominate everything. I mean, it's wild. Now, Hus is an interesting example that you brought up as well, because Hus is a strange character. Hus is ultimately not even aware of what it is that he's saying. Hus, at the Council of Constance, was willing to defend Wycliffe, John Wycliffe. Wycliffe is a heretic. Mm-hmm. Wycliffe is a vile heretic, actually. Hus doesn't understand Wycliffe. And yet what happened is, because he was defending in Bohemia this position that was Czech and nationalist Czech against Germans, he ended up uniting his cause with this English influence that had come into Bohemia, that John Wycliffe's ideas in the 1300s, coming into the 1400s when Hus was active, played a major role in. And he felt in a kind of party spirit obliged to defend Wycliffe. But Wycliffe had no belief in the Eucharist. And Hus, like the Hussites in general, they were deep believers in the Eucharist and in the real presence. And this is what made his inquisitors at the Council of Constance rather disturbed about him. People like Jean Gerson from the University of Paris, they begged Hus in a way to separate himself from Wycliffe, because they don't really believe what Wycliffe believes. And he refused to, because of the fact that he didn't even understand the whole issue. So Hus has become an example of a man persecuted for religious beliefs that perhaps, according to the mythology, ought to have been free, but he's not even aware of what it is that he is saying. And if he were aware of it, he would have probably joined in with his persecutors in persecuting. I mean, go figure. How do you, this is a lot of the stuff that historians have to deal with. It drives you nuts, and that's why we drink.
I like that. All right, Justin the Catholic. Last question here because we got another stream coming up here pretty soon. So we'll wrap it up after this. This is from, again, Justin the Catholic, Dr. Rowe. It seems that after Italy's defeat after or during World War II, we get John the 23rd and a sharp change in the language coming out of the Vatican. Is this the result of an occupation of sorts?
It's one element in it. I'm glad you brought that up because that's a very good observation. But in a way, the victory, the victory of the American alliance in World War II is something that gave a lot of clout to positions which did not emerge out of the United States to begin with, which were very, very much being bandied about in Europe in the 19th and the 20th century, and which were regaining enormous strength in the interwar period in the 1920s and the 30s. If you want to, let me just mention this, in case we run out of time, but these church history lectures I give for the Roman Forum that you can find on SoundCloud. If you look at SoundCloud, Roman Forum church history lectures, you can find the last one that I gave, the last lecture on December 20th. It deals with the situation developing in the 20s and 30s and 40s, and we'll go into more detail on that a little bit later in the year, in Europe, in the Catholic Church in Europe. But what there is already in the 20s and the 30s and the 40s, in a fashion that people like Montini, the future Paul VI, and then Roncalli, John the 23rd, are very much themselves interested in and involved in. There is this growing interest in the need to back off, or in the argument that it's necessary to back off of dogmatic rigor in favor of looking at and tapping into, and this is the favored term that becomes used in the 20s and 30s, witnessing to energies, vital energies that are coming out of youth, out of liturgical movements, out of missionary movements, out of political movements, whose vitality and energy demonstrates the presence of the Holy Spirit guiding you. And rather than cracking down on all of these energies, and politically speaking, this means energies that are reflected in everything from fascist movements to communist movements, that cracking down on these on the basis of dogmatic arguments and catechetical guidance is putting a big wet blanket over what the Holy Spirit wants to teach us. And it's in this regard that people like Teilhard de Chardin, in operating in Jesuit training, are very active in. And what's going to end up happening is all of this stuff, because of the Second World War and the victory first of the fascists, and then of the communists, and then of the Americans, all of this is going to be in ferment in the Catholic world. And a man who's very important in tying together the influence coming from the American world in this regard to that coming from Europe, and in a way that plays into people who were enthusiastic about energies of youth movements, liturgical movements, communist, fascist, and all the rest. A man who ties a lot of this stuff together is Jacques Maritain. Jacques Maritain took part in all kinds of discussions in France in the 20s and the 30s. He goes to Princeton in the 1940s. He becomes enamored of American pluralism, and he argues ultimately that American pluralism offers the opportunity by means of which all different kinds of energetic, and this is language of all these schools of thought, energetic mystiques, milieus, forces of all kinds can show what the Holy Spirit is teaching them in an atmosphere where the church should back away and not doctrinally crack down on, and then to bring Teilhard's argument in, allow to converge at the omega point where they demonstrate that they were all of them aiming towards having Pachamama in the Vatican dominate things. I mean, that's basically where it leads to.
I also pulled up the Roman Forum there, and I'm seeing these church history lectures, and there are quite a few of them, and they look really good. So I put a link to them
Oh, thanks.
in the description to this video, so everybody check it out. It looks like there's a lot of them, and it looks like is it just yourself, or is it some others on here as well?
No, those are just myself. And there's
And
certainly not all of them. Those only start from 1748 onwards. But if I can mention it also, I would urge people to look at. I've got practically everything I've written on a website that's called "For the Whole Christ." It's a term taken from Augustine, Saint Augustine. It's about the mystical body, and "For the Whole Christ." I think the website is. If you pull that up in my name, you'll get it. But it's, I think, J.C. Rao Freeshell, something of that sort. And you find practically everything I've written on there. And I think that's useful too. Just take care about, I wrote a novel at one point, which is very valuable, but it's a little tricky with the language in it. So you have to be careful with it. But it's an anti-pluralist novel. But I appreciate it if you could find a way to link people to that too,
yeah, and give me the name of it again.
It's called under my name. It's called For the Whole Christ. It's, as I say, a term from Saint Augustine, and I think it's J.C. Rao Freeshell, something like that. If you pop it up there.
Yeah, For the Whole Christ, writings by Dr. John C. Rowe. I think I found it here, and I think it's linking to a lot of your all of your articles, in fact.
It's hundreds and hundreds of things.
Yeah. Oh, this is awesome. Okay, I'm gonna also go ahead and include that there.
Great.
I should see that in the description, so everybody look for that to update here on YouTube any moment. Dr. Rowe, I really appreciate you coming on. This was fun. I'd love to have you on again. There's a million other things I'd love to ask you about this topic and many others. So if you're willing, I would love to have you on again. And sorry it was just me and my co-hosts weren't here. But next time I'm sure you'll meet them and engage them as well. So I'd love to have you back on.
And just to tell everybody, pray for me. I'll pray for you. I mean, these are difficult times, but Christ will win.
Indeed. And go ahead and put in a plug for anything else. I got the Roman Forum. I got For the Whole Christ there. Anything else that you wanted to put in a plug for?
Well, no, just always the Remnant, with Mike Matt and my friend Chris Ferrara, who does yeoman service legally for his St. Thomas More Society. He's won so many battles now against Cuomo and against Governor Nuisance in California and various other people. So, we all have to stick together with this because these are tough times.
They sure are. So much more can be said there. Y'all stay tuned here. We have another stream coming up with Dr. Andani and Louis Dizon, who are going to be discussing Islam and Christianity and the differences between us and Muslims. So stay tuned for that. Again, Dr. Rowe, loved having you on. We're going to have you on again. And everybody, thank you for watching. Thank you for being engaged there in the chat, for your questions, for the super chats. And also check us out at patreon.com/Reason and Theology if you would like to support us. Till next time, God bless you all.